The bullet tore through Ethan's shoulder before he even heard the gunshot, and for a moment all he felt was the familiar numbness that had followed him home from the war. He dropped to one knee behind the pine tree, his breaths coming shallow and controlled, as blood seeped through his buckskin shirt. But the real pain came from somewhere deeper, somewhere the Confederate soldiers had carved out during 3 years of hell that turned boys into ghosts. He had been tracking an elk through these Colorado mountains for 2 days, needing the silence and solitude more than the meat, when the shot rang out from somewhere below in the valley. Ethan pressed his calloused hand against the wound and peered through the dense forest, his dark hair falling past his shoulders as he spotted 3 men on horseback surrounding a overturned wagon near the creek. The woman's scream cut through the September air like a blade, and despite every instinct telling him to stay hidden, to let the world handle its own darkness, his legs were already moving. He had spent the last 6 months in these mountains, trying to forget what it meant to be human, what it meant to care, but that sound pulled something from the grave of his old self. Through the gaps between the aspens, he watched 2 men drag a woman from the wreckage while the third rifled through scattered belongings. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her auburn hair had come loose from its pins, and even from this distance, Ethan could see the fierce way she fought against them, clawing and kicking despite being hopelessly outnumbered. He should have kept walking. He should have disappeared back into the mountains, where the only thing that haunted him was his own memories. Instead, Ethan checked the load on his rifle, ignored the burning in his shoulder, and started down the slope with the practiced silence of a man who had learned to move like smoke through enemy territory. The war had taken everything from him. His family's Tennessee farm burned to ash, his younger brother buried in a mass grave outside Petersburg, his faith in God or country or anything resembling justice scattered like leaves in a storm. But it had also taught him how to kill efficiently, and right now, that seemed like the only skill worth having. The first man never saw him coming. Ethan brought the rifle butt down on the back of his skull with enough force to drop him instantly, then swung the barrel toward the second man who had been holding the woman's arms. The outlaw's eyes went wide as he fumbled for his pistol, but Ethan's shot caught him in the chest before the weapon cleared leather. The third man, older and meaner looking with a scar running down his cheek, shoved the woman aside and drew faster than Ethan expected. They fired simultaneously, and Ethan felt the hot sting as a bullet grazed his ribs even as his own shot punched through the outlaw's shoulder, spinning him around. The man stumbled backward into the creek and lay still, either dead or unconscious in the shallow water. The silence that followed felt heavier than the gunfire. Ethan stood there, his whole body trembling not from the wounds but from the sudden rush of violence that brought him right back to those blood-soaked fields, the screams of dying men, the smoke and thunder that never really left his head. His vision tunneled, and for a moment he was not in Colorado but in Virginia, watching his brother take a cannonball that turned him into red mist. Someone was screaming, or maybe that was just in his memory, and his finger tightened on the trigger, even though there was no one left to shoot. Hey, you are bleeding." A woman's voice, close and urgent, cut through the fog. Ethan blinked and found her standing right in front of him, one hand tentatively reaching toward his shoulder. She had green eyes the color of new spring leaves, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but there was something steady in her gaze that anchored him back to the present. "You are hurt, let me help you." He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a rock, his rifle coming up defensively before he forced himself to lower it. "I am fine," he managed, though his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "You need to get out of here. Where were you headed?" "Colorado City," she said, not backing away despite the wild look he knew must be in his eyes. "I was going to stay with my aunt, but the wheel broke and then those men came." Her voice wavered but did not break. "You saved my life, please. You are bleeding badly. At least let me bind those wounds before you collapse." Ethan wanted to refuse, to disappear back into the mountains where he belonged, but his legs chose that moment to give out. He sat down hard on a fallen log, his vision swimming, and before he could protest again, she was already tearing strips from her petticoat with determined efficiency. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady as she pressed fabric against his shoulder wound. This close, he could smell lavender soap mixed with fear sweat, and he had to focus on breathing to keep from flinching away from her touch. "My name is Sarah," she said as she worked, her fingers gentle despite the urgency. "Sarah Jensen. I came all the way from Kansas City after my father died." He left me a little money and a letter from my aunt saying I could stay with her. She runs a boarding house in Colorado City. You should not be traveling alone, Ethan heard himself say, though it came out harsher than he intended. This is dangerous country. I noticed, she replied with a hint of steel in her voice, meeting his eyes. I hired a driver in Denver, but he took off running the moment those men appeared. Took my money bag with him too, the coward. Ethan processed this information slowly, his mind still fighting through the fog of adrenaline and memory. She had no money, no transportation, and 3 dead or dying outlaws nearby. The smart thing would be to point her toward Colorado City and leave her to walk the remaining 15 miles. The smart thing would be to protect himself from any more entanglements with the world he had left behind. But when he looked at her, at the way she kept working on his wounds despite her own fear, at the stubborn set of her jaw, he found himself saying, I will take you to your aunt. Sarah's hand stilled for a moment and she looked up at him with something like surprise. You would do that? But you are hurt and I do not even know your name. Ethan, he said, then added after a pause, Ethan Young, and I will live. Got shot worse than this at Shiloh. He regretted the words immediately when he saw the recognition flash in her eyes, the way she looked at him differently, the way everyone looked at soldiers who came home. Like they were broken things, dangerous and unpredictable. But Sarah just nodded and finished tying off the bandage. Well, Ethan Young, I suppose we should salvage what we can from my wagon and figure out how we are getting to Colorado City. Do you have a horse? Camp is about a mile up the mountain, he said, pushing himself to his feet and ignoring the spinning in his head. Got 2 pack mules. Can ride one, load the other with whatever you need to bring. They worked in tense silence, gathering her scattered belongings while keeping an eye on the outlaws. The one Ethan had hit with his rifle was still breathing but unconscious. The second was definitely dead, and the third had stopped moving in the creek, face down in the water. Sarah moved quickly, efficiently, grabbing a carpet bag and a small trunk, while Ethan checked the outlaws for any identification. He found wanted posters in the dead man's pocket, members of the Dalton gang wanted for robbery and murder across 3 territories. At least no one would come looking for them. We should go before anyone else shows up, Sarah said, clutching her bags. She was trying to appear calm, but Ethan noticed the tremor in her hands, the way she avoided looking at the bodies. She was in shock, probably, running on pure determination and nothing else. He knew that feeling well. The climb back to his camp was harder than it should have been. Ethan's shoulder throbbed with each step, and his ribs burned where the bullet had grazed them. But he kept moving, Sarah following close behind. She did not complain once, even when the path grew steep and treacherous, even when she had to use tree roots to pull herself up the rocky slope. By the time they reached his camp, a small clearing with a lean-to shelter and a fire pit, the sun was starting its descent toward the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah stood in the center of the clearing, looking around at his sparse belongings with something that might have been concern or pity. He had a bedroll, some cooking supplies, traps and furs hanging from the trees, and not much else. It was the camp of a man who had stopped caring about comfort, about the future, about anything beyond getting through each day without screaming. You live up here alone? She asked softly. For 6 months now, Ethan moved to check on his mules, 2 sturdy animals he had bought with the last of his army pay. They nickered at his approach, and he ran his hand along their necks, finding their simple presence more comforting than any human conversation he had had since the war ended. Trapped and hunted, sold furs in Colorado City when I needed supplies. Otherwise kept to myself. That sounds lonely. He did not answer because what could he say? That he preferred the loneliness to the suffocating crowds in town, to the way normal people looked at him like he might explode at any moment, to the constant effort of pretending he was not hearing artillery fire in every thunderstorm. Instead, he gathered supplies for the journey, loading one mule with Sarah's trunk and bags while preparing the other for riding. She was not a large woman, probably weighed no more than 120 pounds, but they would need to move slowly given his injuries and the rough terrain. We should rest here tonight, Sarah said, and when he turned to protest, she held up a hand. You are pale as a ghost, and those wounds need proper cleaning before infection sets in. I can see you swaying on your feet. One more night will not make a difference, and it will be dark soon anyway. She was right, though Ethan hated admitting it. His shoulder had stopped bleeding, but the pain was spreading, a dull ache that promised worse to come, and he could feel fever starting to build behind his eyes. He nodded slowly and watched as Sarah immediately took charge, setting down her bags and looking around the camp with the practical assessment of a woman used to managing things. "Do you have any whiskey?" she asked. "And clean water? I need to properly clean those wounds before they fester." Ethan pointed to his supplies, and Sarah set to work with the same determined efficiency she had shown earlier. She built up the fire while he sat on a log, his muscles finally relaxing now that the immediate danger had passed, and that was when the shaking started. It always happened after violence, after the adrenaline faded and his body remembered all the reasons it should have given up a long time ago. His hands trembled, his breathing came too fast, and the world tilted sideways as memories crashed over him in waves. He was back in the trenches at Petersburg, buried under dirt when the mine exploded, choking on smoke and blood, and the screams of men being torn apart. He was watching his brother get blown into pieces, feeling the hot spray of blood across his face, knowing he should have been standing where Samuel was standing. He was stumbling through the hospital tent after Appomattox, seeing rows of men missing limbs, missing minds, missing everything that made them who they used to be. "Ethan." Sarah's voice cut through the chaos, firm and grounding. She was kneeling in front of him, her hands on his knees, her green eyes locked on his. "Ethan, look at me. You are in Colorado. It is 1868. The war is over. You are safe." He focused on her face, on the reality of her presence, and slowly, so slowly, the past released its grip, his breathing evened out, and the shaking subsided to a manageable tremor. Sarah did not look scared or disgusted, just patient, and somehow that made it worse because he did not deserve her kindness. "Sorry," he managed. "Happens sometimes. I am fine." "You are not fine," she said gently. "But you do not have to be, not right now." She moved back to give him space and returned with whiskey and clean cloth. "This is going to hurt." She was not lying. The whiskey burned like hellfire when she poured it into the shoulder wound, and Ethan had to bite down on a leather strap to keep from crying out. Sarah worked with steady hands, cleaning both wounds thoroughly before rebandaging them with proper strips of cloth. She had clearly done this before, probably nursed her father through his final illness, and her touch was sure and confident despite the situation. "Thank you," Ethan said when she finished, his voice rough. "For not running. Most people run when they see me like that." Sarah settled on the other side of the fire, accepting the strip of dried venison he offered. "My father was at Wilson's Creek back in '61, she said quietly, staring into the flames. "He never talked about it, but he had nightmares until the day he died. Used to wake up screaming about Bloody Hill, about watching his friends get cut down by artillery. So I know a little about what you are carrying." They sat in silence as darkness fell over the mountains, the fire crackling between them and casting dancing shadows across the clearing. Ethan found himself studying her in the firelight, really looking at her for the first time since the chaos in the valley. She was probably 23 or 24, with a face that was more handsome than pretty, strong features, and a mouth that looked like it smiled easily even though she was not smiling now. Her dress was ruined, torn, and bloodstained, but she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. She had been terrified down in that valley. He had seen it in her eyes, but she had not fallen apart. She had fought, and then she had helped him, and now she was sitting across from him like being stranded in the mountains with a half-crazy war veteran was just another problem to solve. "How old are you?" he asked, then winced at how abrupt it sounded. 24, Sarah replied. "We'll be 25 in December. How old are you?" 27. "We'll be 28 in October." He paused, then added, "Joined up when I was 20. Thought I was going to save the Union and come home a hero. Came home nothing but a ghost." "You are not nothing," Sarah said firmly, meeting his eyes across the fire. "You saved my life today. That is something." Ethan wanted to argue, to explain that he had not saved her life as much as just reacted on instinct, that violence was the only thing he had left in him, but he was too tired to form the words. Instead, he spread out his bedroll and offered Sarah the shelter of the lean-to, which she accepted with quiet gratitude. He lay down by the fire, his rifle within reach, and stared up at the stars while listening to her settle in for the night. He should have been planning their route to Colorado City, should have been thinking about practical matters, but all he could focus on was the strange warmth of having another human presence in his camp, of not being entirely alone for the first time in months. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by fever dreams and the usual nightmares. He woke once to find Sarah sitting beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead, and he was too disoriented to do anything but accept her care before slipping back under. When he finally woke properly, dawn was breaking over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Sarah was already up, tending the fire and heating water for coffee. She had changed into a fresh dress from her trunk, a simple blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes, and had pinned her hair up in a neat bun. She looked tired but determined, and when she saw he was awake, she smiled. "How are you feeling?" she asked, bringing him a cup of coffee. "Like I got shot twice and then climbed a mountain," Ethan admitted, sitting up carefully. His shoulder was stiff and painful, but the fever seemed to have broken during the night, and his head was clearer. "But I will manage. We should get moving if we want to reach Colorado City before dark." They broke camp efficiently, Ethan moving slower than he wanted, but refusing Sarah's offers of help. He saddled the larger mule for her and loaded their supplies on the other, then led them down the mountain on foot, following the game trails he had learned over the past months. Sarah rode without complaint, occasionally asking questions about the landscape or the wildlife, and Ethan found himself answering in more than monosyllables, despite his usual preference for silence. She had a curious mind, asking about everything from how to identify animal tracks to what plants were edible, and her genuine interest made talking easier than it had been in a long time. They stopped at midday to rest the animals and eat a cold meal of hardtack and dried meat. Sarah had produced a canteen of water and some apples from her bags, which she shared generously. They sat on a fallen log overlooking a valley of golden aspens, and for a moment Ethan let himself pretend this was normal, that he was just a man helping a woman reach her destination, not a broken soldier trying to remember how to be human. "Why did you come to Colorado?" he asked, breaking their comfortable silence. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "After my father died, there was nothing left for me in Kansas City. He had debts I could not pay, and the house had to be sold. My mother died when I was 16, and I have no siblings. My Aunt Elizabeth wrote saying she could use help running her boarding house, and it seemed like a sign, a fresh start somewhere new." She glanced at him. "What about you?" "Why, the mountains." Ethan considered his answer carefully. "After Appomattox, I tried going back to Tennessee. The farm was gone, my brother was dead, my father died of a heart attack when he got the news about Samuel. I spent 2 months trying to rebuild, but every night I would wake up screaming, and every loud noise sent me diving for cover. The neighbors started avoiding me, calling me crazy, so I sold what was left and headed west. Figured the mountains might be quiet enough to let me forget." "Did they?" Sarah asked softly. "No," he admitted. "But at least there is no one around to bother me about it. Except for now," she said with a small smile. "Except for now," he agreed, and found himself almost smiling back. They reached the outskirts of Colorado City as the sun was setting. The town is spreading out in the valley below them with its main street of false front buildings, its scattering of houses and corrals, and the silver ribbon of Fountain Creek running alongside. Ethan had been here a handful of times to trade furs and buy supplies, but he had always left as quickly as possible, unable to tolerate the noise and crowds for more than a few hours. Now, with Sarah riding beside him, the town felt less threatening somehow, just a collection of buildings filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. "My aunt's boarding house is on 3rd Street, Sarah said, consulting a letter from her pocket. "Near the church. She said it has a blue-painted sign. They found it easily enough. A 2-story building in better repair than most, with a small garden out front, and the promised blue sign reading Jensen's boarding house swinging in the evening breeze." Ethan helped Sarah down from the mule and was carrying her trunk toward the porch when the front door burst open and a woman in her 50s rushed out, her face a mixture of relief and concern. "Sarah? Oh, thank God, I have been worried sick. Your driver arrived 3 days ago saying there had been trouble on the road, but he did not know what happened to you." The woman pulled Sarah into a tight embrace, then held her at arm's length, taking in her disheveled appearance. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "I am fine, Aunt Elizabeth," Sarah assured her, though her voice wavered slightly. "There was an accident, and then some men attacked me, but Ethan here saved my life and brought me to town." She gestured toward him. "This is Ethan Young. He is a mountain man." Elizabeth turned to assess Ethan with sharp, intelligent eyes, and he felt himself being catalogued and judged in the span of seconds. She was a handsome woman with Sarah's same strong features and green eyes, her hair shot through with gray, and she carried herself with the no-nonsense air of someone used to running a business and managing people. "A mountain man who happens to be shot and bleeding," Elizabeth observed, noting the blood seeping through his shirt. "Sarah, get him inside immediately, Mr. Young. I insist you let me look at those wounds properly and stay for dinner at the very least. I will not have you collapsing in the street after saving my niece." Ethan wanted to refuse, to head back to his mountains before he got drawn any further into the world of regular people, but Sarah was already taking his arm and pulling him toward the door with surprising strength for someone who barely reached his shoulder. "Please, Ethan," she said quietly. "It is the least we can do, and you need proper medical attention. Your wounds need checking." He found himself being ushered inside, through a clean parlor with comfortable furniture and framed paintings, and up the stairs to a room with an actual bed, wash basin, and window overlooking the street. It was more civilization than he had experienced in months, and the walls felt like they were closing in, but before panic could set in, Sarah was there, guiding him to sit on the bed while Elizabeth bustled off to fetch medical supplies. "I should not be here," Ethan said, his chest tight. "I do not belong in places like this anymore." "You belong wherever you choose to be," Sarah countered, already working on the buttons of his shirt to access the wounds. "Now stop being stubborn and let us help you." Elizabeth returned with a proper medical kit, hot water, and clean bandages, and between the two women, they stripped away Ethan's ruined shirt and properly cleaned both wounds. The shoulder was worse than he had thought, the bullet having gone clean through but tearing muscle on its path, and the rib graze was deeper than he had realized. Elizabeth worked with practiced efficiency, clearly having nursed many injuries over the years, and she kept up a steady stream of conversation that somehow made the pain more bearable. "You are lucky these did not fester," she scolded gently as she applied salve to his shoulder. "Another day and you would have been facing serious infection. As it is, you need rest and proper food to heal. I will not hear any arguments, Mr. Young. You will stay here at least 3 days until I am satisfied you are not going to fall over dead." "I do not have money for a boarding house," Ethan said bluntly. "Did I ask for money?" Elizabeth countered, meeting his eyes with that same firm look Sarah sometimes got. "You saved my niece's life. That buys you a room and meals for as long as you need them. Besides, I can see you are a man running from something, and in my experience, running never solved anything. 3 days of rest might do you more good than 6 months in those mountains did." Before Ethan could formulate an argument, Sarah returned with a tray bearing soup, bread, and coffee. The smell alone made his stomach growl audibly, reminding him he had eaten nothing but dried meat and hardtack for days. Sarah set the tray on a small table and pulled up a chair, settling in like she had no intention of leaving until he ate. "Eat," she ordered, "then sleep. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next." Ethan ate because he was too tired to argue, and the soup was the best thing he had tasted in months, rich with vegetables and tender beef. Sarah watched him with those steady green eyes, and he found himself unable to meet her gaze for more than a few seconds at a time. She had seen him at his worst, had witnessed his breakdown in the mountains, and yet she was still here, still looking at him like he was a person worth caring about. It was more terrifying than any battle he had fought. When he finished eating, Elizabeth shooed Sarah out and left him alone with strict instructions to sleep. Ethan lay down on the soft mattress, so different from his bedroll on the hard ground, and stared at the ceiling. He should have felt trapped in this room with its 4 walls and closed door, but instead he felt something he barely recognized anymore. Safe. He felt safe, and that realization kept him awake long into the night, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around him, the murmur of voices from downstairs, the creak of footsteps in the hall, all the noises of human life that he had been avoiding for so long. Sleep finally claimed him near midnight, and for the first time in months he did not dream of war. The next 3 days passed in a strange blur of enforced rest and quiet domesticity. Elizabeth ruled her boarding house with efficient kindness, and she had apparently decided that Ethan was now under her care, whether he liked it or not. She brought him meals, changed his bandages, and engaged him in conversation about everything from politics to the weather, never pressing when he grew silent, but never letting him retreat entirely into himself either. Sarah visited frequently, bringing books from Elizabeth's small library and reading aloud when the walls started closing in on him, her voice calm and steady, anchoring him to the present. On the second day, when Ethan was feeling strong enough to venture downstairs, he found Sarah in the kitchen helping Elizabeth prepare dinner for the boarders. She had rolled up her sleeves and tied on an apron, her hair coming loose from its pins as she kneaded bread dough with fierce concentration. When she looked up and saw him in the doorway, her face lit up with a smile that did something strange to his chest. "You are out of bed," she said, wiping flour on her apron. "That is a good sign. How are you feeling?" "Better," Ethan admitted, leaning against the doorframe because standing still upright took more energy than he wanted to admit. "Your aunt is a determined nurse. She gets it from her mother," Elizabeth called from where she was stirring a large pot on the stove. "My mama could have nursed Napoleon himself back from the dead through sheer willpower. Now, Mr. Young, since you are up, you might as well make yourself useful, Sarah. Show him how to peel potatoes. We have 8 boarders tonight, and they all eat like horses." Ethan found himself seated at the kitchen table with a knife and a bowl of potatoes, Sarah working beside him on the bread. It was peaceful in a way he had not expected, the simple domestic task requiring just enough attention to keep his mind occupied. But not so much that he could not appreciate the warm kitchen, the smell of baking bread, the sound of Sarah humming softly as she worked. He had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something, to contribute to the daily rhythm of life instead of just surviving alone in the wilderness. "You are good at that," Sarah observed, watching him work. "Quick and efficient." "Had to help cook for my regiment sometimes," Ethan said, then immediately regretted bringing up the war. But Sarah just nodded, not pushing for more details, and they continued working in comfortable silence. That evening, Ethan ate dinner with Sarah, Elizabeth, and the boarders, a collection of miners, merchants, and ranch hands who filled the dining room with loud conversation and laughter. It was overwhelming at first, too many people in too small a space, but Sarah sat beside him and occasionally touched his arm when she sensed him starting to panic, grounding him with that simple contact. He found himself slowly relaxing, even contributing to the conversation when one of the miners started talking about a big cat he had seen in the mountains. Ethan knew those mountains better than anyone, and he shared what he knew about mountain lion territories and behavior, earning respectful nods from the men. After dinner, Sarah walked with him out to the front porch, where they sat on the steps and watched the town settle into evening quiet. The September air was cooling rapidly, hinting at the winter to come, and Sarah wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. "Thank you for staying," she said quietly. "I know it is hard for you being around so many people." "Your aunt is persuasive," Ethan replied, then added more honestly, "and I did not want to leave yet." Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the dim light from the parlor windows. "Why not?" Ethan struggled to find words for the feeling, the strange pull that kept him rooted to this porch instead of running back to his mountains. "Because when I am around you, the nightmares are quieter," he finally said. "I do not understand it, but it is true. You make things quieter." Sarah was silent for a long moment, and Ethan worried he had said too much, revealed too much of the damaged person underneath. But then she reached over and took his hand, her fingers small and warm against his calloused palm, and said, "You make me feel brave. When those men attacked me, I thought I was going to die, and I was so scared. But then you came, and even though I could see you were hurting too, you fought for me. You have been fighting for so long, Ethan. Maybe it is time to let someone fight for you." Something cracked open in Ethan's chest, something he had kept locked tight since Samuel died. Since the war ended and he realized he had no home to return to, he turned his hand over and squeezed Sarah's fingers, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. And they sat there together as stars emerged in the darkening sky. On the 3rd day, Elizabeth pronounced him well enough to move around freely, but insisted he stay another week to ensure the wounds were properly healed. Ethan knew he should refuse, should get back to his mountains before he got too comfortable, but he found himself agreeing. The truth was, he was not ready to leave yet, not ready to return to the isolation that had been slowly killing him even as it kept him safe from the memories. So he stayed, and he started making himself useful around the boarding house. He repaired loose boards on the porch, fixed a broken window frame, and rebuilt the wobbly front steps that Elizabeth had been complaining about for months. He worked with his hands, letting the physical labor occupy his mind, and slowly, day by day, the constant tension in his shoulders began to ease. Sarah was often nearby, hanging laundry or tending the garden or helping Elizabeth with the endless tasks of running a boarding house, and they fell into an easy companionship that felt as natural as breathing. One afternoon, while Ethan was repairing the chicken coop behind the house, Sarah came out with lemonade and settled on an overturned bucket to watch him work. He had stripped off his shirt in the warm September sun, and he was aware of her eyes on the scars that crisscrossed his back and chest, the permanent marks of war written on his body. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly. "The scars, I mean. Not anymore, Ethan said, hammering a nail into place. At first they did, but now they just remind me of things I would rather forget. He paused, then added, I got these at Andersonville. Was captured in '64, spent 3 months in that hell before we were liberated. Lost 30 pounds and nearly lost my mind. These scars are from the fights that broke out over scraps of food, over accusations of stealing, over nothing at all really, except we were all going crazy locked in there. Sarah was quiet, absorbing this, and when Ethan glanced at her, he saw tears on her cheeks. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry you went through that, not your fault, Ethan said, setting down his hammer and moving to sit beside her. War does terrible things to people. I just got unlucky enough to survive it. No, Sarah said firmly, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. You got strong enough to survive it. There is a difference. Ethan caught her hand and held it against his cheek, closing his eyes and letting himself feel her touch, the warmth of her skin, the steady pulse in her wrist. When he opened his eyes again, Sarah was looking at him with such tenderness that it made his chest ache. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he leaned forward and kissed her forehead, then her cheek, and finally, when she did not move, her lips. The kiss was gentle, questioning, nothing like the desperate clawing need he had felt with women in the past. This was different, softer, and when Sarah kissed him back, her hand coming up to tangle in his long hair, Ethan felt something inside him begin to heal. They broke apart after a moment, both breathing hard, and Sarah smiled at him with wonder in her eyes. I have been wanting you to do that for days, she admitted. I have been wanting to do it since you saved me from my nightmares that first night, Ethan replied. I just did not think I had the right. I am not exactly good company, Sarah. I have nightmares most nights. I cannot handle crowds, and I do not know if I will ever be normal again. I do not want normal, Sarah said, taking both his hands in hers. I want you, the you that exists right now, nightmares and all. We all carry damage, Ethan. The question is whether we let it destroy us or whether we find someone willing to help carry the weight. She squeezed his hands. I want to help carry your weight if you will let me. Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest, and for the first time in 3 years he let himself cry. Sarah held him through it, her hands stroking his hair, whispering words of comfort and love, and when the storm finally passed, Ethan felt lighter than he had since before the war started. They stayed there in the afternoon sun, wrapped in each other's arms, and Ethan knew with absolute certainty that he had found something worth staying for. That evening at dinner, Elizabeth announced that she had hired Ethan to be the boarding house handyman, a position she claimed she had been trying to fill for months. The pay was modest but came with room and board, and Ethan suspected Sarah had put her up to it, but he accepted gratefully. The truth was he did not want to go back to the mountains anymore. He wanted to stay here, close to Sarah, close to this chance at a normal life that he had thought was forever beyond his reach. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Ethan worked on repairs around the boarding house and occasionally took jobs from other townspeople who needed carpentry or building work done. His skills from growing up on a farm served him well, and word spread quickly that he was reliable and skilled. Sarah helped Elizabeth with the boarding house, but also started teaching at the small schoolhouse that had just opened, discovering she had a gift for working with children. In the evenings they would sit on the porch together, talking about their days, their dreams, their fears, and slowly, carefully, building something real between them. The nightmares did not disappear, but they grew less frequent. When Ethan woke screaming, Sarah was there, sitting beside him in the darkness, talking him through the panic until he could breathe again. She never flinched from his damage, never made him feel like he was too broken to love, and gradually Ethan started believing he might actually deserve the happiness she offered. October arrived with brilliant displays of autumn color across the valley, and Ethan turned 28 surrounded by people who had become a makeshift family. Elizabeth baked a cake, the boarders sang an off-key but enthusiastic rendition of a birthday song, and Sarah gave him a new shirt she had sewn herself, the fabric soft and well-made. Later, when they were alone on the porch, she gave him a second gift, a small leather journal with blank pages. For your thoughts, she explained when he looked at her questioningly. Elizabeth's doctor friend says sometimes writing about the war helps soldiers process what they went through. You do not have to show it to anyone, it is just for you, but maybe putting the memories on paper will help get them out of your head. Ethan opened the journal and saw she had written something on the first page in her neat handwriting. For Ethan, who survived the war and is learning to live again. With all my love, Sarah. I love you, he said, the words coming easily now after weeks of holding them back. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I love you more than I thought I could love anything. Sarah's face lit up with joy, and she kissed him deeply, not caring that anyone passing by could see them. I love you too, she said against his lips. I think I started loving you that first night in the mountains when you could have left me but chose to stay. I will always stay, Ethan promised. As long as you want me, I will stay. By November, it was clear to everyone in town that Ethan and Sarah were courting seriously, and Elizabeth had long since stopped pretending to chaperone their evening porch talks. Ethan had integrated into town life more than he ever thought possible, making friends among the other tradesmen and even occasionally joining them at the saloon for a drink, though he always left before the crowd got too loud or rowdy. He was learning his limits, learning when to push himself and when to retreat, and Sarah supported him through all of it with patient understanding. One cold November evening, as they sat bundled together on the porch swing Elizabeth had installed, Ethan pulled out a small wooden box from his pocket. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a simple silver ring with a small turquoise stone, the best he could afford on his modest wages. Sarah Jensen, he said, his voice steady despite the nervous pounding of his heart. I know I am not much of a catch. I have nightmares and scars and days when I can barely function, but you make me want to be better, want to keep living instead of just surviving. Will you marry me? Sarah stared at the ring, tears streaming down her face, then launched herself at him so enthusiastically that the porch swing nearly tipped over. Yes, she said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, yes, absolutely yes. Ethan slipped the ring on her finger and they kissed in the cold November air, the future spreading out before them full of possibility and hope. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway a moment later, suspiciously close to their private moment, and when she saw the ring on Sarah's hand, she started crying too and pulled them both into a fierce hug. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church on 3rd Street, with Elizabeth and half the town in attendance. Ethan wore his new shirt and had trimmed his hair and beard, though he kept them longer than was fashionable, because Sarah liked running her fingers through his hair. Sarah wore a simple white dress she and Elizabeth had made together, and she carried wildflowers that Ethan had pressed between book pages to preserve through the winter. The ceremony was short and heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed his bride with tears running down his face, overwhelmed by the miracle of this second chance at life. Elizabeth gave them the largest room in the boarding house as a wedding present, a corner room with windows facing both the street and the mountains, and Ethan carried Sarah over the threshold while she laughed and held onto his shoulders. That night, they made love slowly and tenderly, taking time to explore and learn each other's bodies, and when Ethan woke later from a nightmare, Sarah was there immediately, pulling him into her arms and murmuring that he was safe, that she was here, that everything would be all right. I am sorry, he whispered into her hair. I am sorry you have to deal with this. Stop apologizing for surviving, Sarah said firmly. You are alive, Ethan. You are here with me. That is all that matters. Winter settled over Colorado City with heavy snows and bitter cold, and Ethan spent his days doing indoor repair work and his evenings curled up with Sarah in their room, reading or talking or simply existing together in comfortable silence. He started writing in the journal she had given him, putting down the memories that haunted him, and, while it did not make them disappear, it did seem to lessen their power over him. Sarah never asked to read what he wrote, respecting his privacy, but sometimes he would read passages aloud to her, sharing the weight of his past so she could help him carry it. Christmas arrived, and they celebrated with Elizabeth and the boarders, exchanging simple gifts and sharing a feast that Elizabeth had been preparing for days. Ethan gave Sarah a pair of pearl earrings he had saved for months to afford, and she gave him a new winter coat lined with fur, practical but made with love. They sang carols around the piano in the parlor, and Ethan found himself actually enjoying the celebration, the warmth and companionship filling some of the empty spaces the war had carved out of him. As winter turned to spring, Sarah discovered she was pregnant, and the news sent Ethan into a panic he had not experienced since his worst days. He was terrified of being a father, terrified that his damage would somehow hurt the child, that his nightmares would traumatize an innocent soul. But Sarah talked him through the fear with her characteristic patience, reminding him that fear meant he cared, and that caring was the first step toward being a good parent. You are going to be a wonderful father, she insisted one evening as they lay in bed, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I know you are scared, but I have seen how gentle you are with the children at school, how patient you are when they ask you questions about the animals in the mountains. Our child will be lucky to have you." "I do not want to fail them," Ethan admitted. "Or you. You both deserve better than a broken man." "You are not broken," Sarah said fiercely, taking his face in her hands. "You are healing. There is a difference, and we are going to heal together, as a family." The baby was born in early October 1869, a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. They named him Samuel after Ethan's brother, and when the doctor placed the tiny bundle in Ethan's arms, he felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was his son, his blood, a new person who had never seen war or suffering, who depended on Ethan to keep him safe and loved. The responsibility was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. "Hello, Samuel," Ethan whispered, running his finger over the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "I promise to do better for you than the world did for me. I promise to keep you safe." Sarah smiled from the bed, exhausted but radiant, and Ethan felt his heart expand to hold this new overwhelming love. He had thought he had used up all his capacity for love in the war, watching it die with every friend he lost. But here was proof that love could regenerate, could grow stronger than hate and fear. Fatherhood changed Ethan in ways he had not expected. The nightmares did not disappear, but they mattered less somehow, because even on the worst nights, he could check on Samuel sleeping in the cradle beside their bed, and remember he had something worth waking up for. He became even more skilled at his carpentry work, driven by the need to provide for his growing family, and his reputation spread beyond Colorado City. People from Denver and Pueblo started hiring him for specialized projects, and he found himself earning enough to start saving money. When Samuel was 6 months old, Ethan and Sarah bought a small plot of land on the edge of town with a view of the mountains and started building their own house. Ethan designed it himself, a modest 2-story with a wide porch and large windows to let in the light, and he poured all his skill and love into every board and nail. Sarah helped when she could, sanding wood and painting trim, and Elizabeth provided endless advice and assistance with Samuel. By the time their son took his first steps, they were moving into their finished home, and Ethan stood in the empty parlor feeling an almost painful sense of accomplishment. "We did it," Sarah said, coming to stand beside him with Samuel balanced on her hip. "We built a home." "You built more than that," Ethan replied, pulling them both into his arms. "You built a life. You took a broken man living alone in the mountains and gave him a reason to keep living. You gave me everything." Life settled into a new rhythm in their house. Ethan continued his carpentry work, building furniture, and taking on construction projects around the growing town. Sarah taught school part-time and cared for Samuel, and Elizabeth visited frequently, doting on her great-nephew and offering wisdom whenever they needed it. The nightmares still came, but less frequently now, and Ethan had learned to manage them better with Sarah's help and the grounding presence of his family. When Samuel was 2, Sarah became pregnant again, and this time Ethan felt excitement rather than terror. He had proven to himself that he could be a good father, that his past did not have to dictate his future, and he looked forward to expanding their family. The baby, a daughter they named Emma after Sarah's mother, arrived in the spring of 1872 with Sarah's red hair and Ethan's serious expression. She was a calm baby, content to watch the world with curious eyes, and Samuel adored his little sister with a devotion that made both parents cry happy tears. The years passed in a blur of children's laughter and quiet domesticity. Ethan built toys for his children and additions onto their house as the family grew. Sarah eventually stopped teaching to focus on raising Samuel and Emma, though she continued to tutor children in the evenings who needed extra help. Elizabeth sold the boarding house in 1874 and moved into a small cottage near their home, wanting to be close to her family but maintain her independence. Ethan never forgot what the war had done to him, the scars it had left both visible and invisible. But he learned to live with it rather than letting it control him. He attended church regularly, not because he had regained his faith in God, but because it gave him a community and a sense of routine that helped keep the darkness at bay. He made friends with other veterans in town, and they formed an informal support group, meeting once a month to talk about their experiences and help each other through the hard days. On his 35th birthday in October 1876, Ethan sat on his porch watching Samuel, now 7, chase Emma, 5, through the front yard while they shrieked with laughter. Sarah emerged from the house with a pitcher of lemonade and settled into the chair beside him, her hand automatically finding his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, following his gaze to their children. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Ethan replied honestly. 10 years ago, I was living alone in those mountains, convinced I would never be happy again, convinced the war had taken everything from me. And then you appeared, and you saved me just as surely as I saved you that day." Sarah squeezed his hand. "We saved each other," she corrected gently. "I was lost too, remember? Running from a life that had fallen apart. No idea what I was going to do or who I was going to be. We found each other at exactly the right moment. Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked, voicing a fear he rarely acknowledged. "Tying yourself to a man with so much baggage?" "Never," Sarah said firmly, turning to look at him with those steady green eyes that had been his anchor for so many years. "Not once, not even on the hardest days. You are the best man I know, Ethan Young. You are a wonderful father, a loving husband, and a good person despite everything the world tried to do to you. Our children are lucky to have you, and so am I." Ethan pulled her close and kissed her deeply, tasting the lemonade on her lips and the sweetness of this life they had built together. Samuel made a gagging noise from the yard, and Emma giggled, and Ethan and Sarah broke apart, laughing. That evening, after the children were asleep, they lay in bed together talking about the future. Samuel would start proper school in the fall. Emma was showing an interest in drawing, and Sarah was pregnant again, though they were keeping it quiet until she was further along. Ethan had been offered a major contract to help build a new hotel in Denver, work that would take him away from home for weeks at a time, and he was conflicted about whether to accept it. "I do not want to be away from you and the children that long," he admitted, running his hand over Sarah's hair. "But the money would let us expand the house, maybe even help Samuel go to college someday if he wants." "Then accept it," Sarah said simply. "Yes, we will miss you, but we will be here when you get back, and Samuel is old enough now to help me around the house. Besides, I think it will be good for you to take on a bigger challenge, to prove to yourself that you can do it." "You have too much faith in me," Ethan said, but he was smiling. "I have exactly the right amount of faith in you," Sarah countered. "Now go to sleep. You have a big day tomorrow, and Emma wants you to help her build that treehouse you promised." Ethan accepted the Denver contract, and while the weeks away from home were difficult, the work itself was satisfying in a way he had not experienced before. He was leading a crew of 5 men, responsible for major structural work on the hotel, and the challenge pushed him to grow beyond what he thought he was capable of. He wrote letters to Sarah every day, and she wrote back with news of the children and life in Colorado City, and those letters sustained him through the long days and lonely nights. When he came home in December 1876, Sarah was showing with the pregnancy, and Emma had learned to read, and Samuel had built his own small toolbox and insisted on helping with every project around the house. Ethan spent the weeks before Christmas making up for lost time, showering his family with attention and finishing the treehouse he had promised Emma. On Christmas morning, watching his children tear into the presents he and Sarah had carefully selected, Ethan felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. The baby, another boy they named Jacob, arrived in April 1877, and Ethan was there for the birth this time, holding Sarah's hand and murmuring encouragement as she labored through the long night. When Jacob finally emerged, red-faced and screaming, Ethan cut the cord himself and marveled at the miracle of new life, at the fact that he had helped create this tiny, perfect person. 3 children, he said wonderingly, cradling Jacob while the midwife tended to Sarah. "We have 3 children, and a very full house," Sarah added with a tired laugh. "I think this might be enough, do you not agree?" "More than enough," Ethan agreed, leaning down to kiss her sweaty forehead. "This is more than I ever dreamed of having." The years that followed were busy and chaotic and wonderful. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved learning and showed an aptitude for mathematics that surprised both his parents. Emma was creative and wild, always drawing or building something, and she followed Ethan around like a shadow, insisting on helping with his carpentry projects. Jacob was the most social of the 3, making friends wherever he went and charming everyone with his sunny disposition. Ethan continued taking on bigger projects, his reputation as a skilled carpenter spreading throughout Colorado. He built houses, barns, schools, and even a small church in a neighboring town, and each project added to the savings account he and Sarah maintained at the Colorado City Bank. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. The nightmares never completely disappeared. But by 1880, they came only a few times a month rather than nightly, and Ethan had learned techniques for managing them. He kept a journal by the bed and wrote down the nightmares when they woke him, getting them out of his head and onto paper where they could not hurt him. Sarah read some of them, bearing witness to his pain, and her steady presence reminded him that the past was past and the present was real. In the fall of 1880, on a crisp October morning, Ethan stood in front of the one-room schoolhouse where Sarah had taught years ago and watched Samuel, now 11, confidently stride through the doors for his first day of advanced classes with the new teacher from Denver. Emma, 9, skipped beside her brother, her satchel swinging, already chattering about the art supplies the teacher had promised. Jacob, 3, clung to Sarah's hand, too young for school but demanding to know when he would be old enough to join his siblings. "They grow up so fast," Sarah said softly, watching their children disappear into the school. "It feels like just yesterday we were bringing Samuel home from the hospital." "Best 11 years of my life," Ethan replied, pulling her and Jacob close. "Every single day, even the hard ones." They walked back home together, Jacob between them swinging on their joined hands, and Ethan felt the familiar surge of gratitude that had become a constant companion. He thought about the man he had been in 1868, broken and alone in the mountains, convinced his life was over at 27. That man would never have believed he could be this happy, could have this full, rich life surrounded by love and purpose. That evening, after the children were in bed, Ethan sat on the porch with Sarah and watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat in comfortable silence, not needing words to communicate the depth of their connection. "I have been thinking," Sarah said eventually, "about that day in the valley when you saved me. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had chosen differently? If you had stayed in your camp and let me find my own way?" "All the time," Ethan admitted, "and every time I am grateful I made the choice I did. You changed my life, Sarah. You gave me back my humanity when I thought I had lost it forever." "You did the same for me," Sarah replied. "I was so lost after my father died, so scared of what the future held. But you showed me that even broken things can heal, that even the worst experiences do not have to define us forever. You taught me to be brave." They kissed as the sun dipped below the mountains, and Ethan tasted salt on Sarah's lips and realized she was crying. "What is wrong?" he asked, concerned. "Nothing is wrong," Sarah assured him, wiping her eyes. "I am just so happy, and sometimes happiness is overwhelming. I love you so much, Ethan Young, and I am so proud of the man you have become, the father you are, the life we have built together." "I love you too," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than words can say. You are my whole world, you and the children. Everything good in my life came from you." They went inside eventually, checking on the children one last time before retiring to their own room. Samuel was sprawled across his bed with a book still open on his chest. Emma had fallen asleep with charcoal on her fingers from her evening drawing session, and Jacob was curled up with the stuffed bear Ethan had carved for him, his thumb in his mouth despite being too old for such things. Ethan kissed each of their foreheads, his heart so full it ached, and sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever force had brought Sarah into his life. The years continued to pass in a steady rhythm of seasons and milestones. Samuel excelled in school and talked about becoming an engineer, fascinated by the bridges and buildings Ethan sometimes took him to see. Emma discovered a love for teaching and started helping at the school, working with younger children who struggled with reading. Jacob proved to be a natural with animals, collecting every stray dog and cat in town and nursing them back to health with gentle patience. Elizabeth passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1883, and while her death hit the family hard, they took comfort in knowing she had lived a full life and had been surrounded by love until the end. She left her cottage to Sarah, and they rented it out to a young couple new to Colorado City, using the income to help pay for Samuel's education. In 1885, Samuel left for college in Denver, the first person in either Ethan or Sarah's family to pursue higher education. Ethan helped him pack, his hand shaking slightly as he folded clothes and organized books, overwhelmed by pride and terror in equal measure. Samuel was 17 now, tall and serious, with Ethan's dark hair and Sarah's green eyes, and watching him prepare to leave felt like watching a piece of Ethan's heart walk away. "You are going to do amazing things," Ethan told his son the night before he left. "I am so proud of you, Samuel. Your uncle would have been proud too." "Tell me about him again," Samuel asked, settling onto the porch steps beside Ethan. About Uncle Samuel. Ethan had told this story many times over the years, but he never tired of sharing memories of his brother, keeping Samuel's memory alive through his namesake. He was funny and brave and kinder than anyone I have ever known, Ethan said. He enlisted because he believed in fighting for what was right, and he died protecting his friends during a battle. He was only 20 years old, younger than you are now, but he lived more in those 20 years than many people do in 80. I will make you both proud, Samuel promised, and Ethan pulled him into a fierce embrace. This son who had helped save him just by existing. The house felt empty without Samuel, but Emma and Jacob filled the spaces with their own chaos and energy. Emma was 15 now, beautiful and artistic, turning down suitors left and right because she wanted to focus on teaching. Jacob was 8, all boundless energy and enthusiasm, already talking about becoming a veterinarian someday. Ethan continued his carpentry work, though he took on fewer projects now, preferring to spend time with his family and enjoy the life he had built. In the spring of 1888, Samuel came home from college with a degree in engineering and a job offer from a firm in Denver. He was 20 now, a man grown, and Ethan struggled with the realization that his son no longer needed him in the same way. But Sarah reminded him that love did not require need, that watching their children grow into independent adults was the goal all along, and Ethan tried to take comfort in her wisdom. Emma followed Samuel to Denver in 1889 to attend normal school and become a certified teacher, leaving just Jacob at home. The house felt enormous and quiet with only 3 of them, and Ethan and Sarah found themselves rediscovering each other, going on long walks through the mountains, sitting on the porch for hours just talking, reconnecting as a couple rather than just parents. I miss them, Sarah admitted one evening, leaning against Ethan as they watched the sunset. But I also love having time with just you again. We have been so focused on the children for so long, it is nice to remember we are also husband and wife. Best decision I ever made marrying you, Ethan said, kissing her temple. Even better than building that treehouse for Emma. Sarah laughed, the sound filling Ethan with warmth. That treehouse almost killed you? You fell off the ladder twice. Worth it to see her face when it was finished, Ethan countered. Everything is worth it for them, for you. Jacob left for veterinary school in 1897, the last of their children to leave home, and Ethan and Sarah found themselves alone in the house for the first time in nearly 30 years. It was strange and bittersweet, walking through rooms that had once echoed with children's laughter, but it was also peaceful. They took up hobbies they had set aside, Ethan returning to woodcarving and Sarah to painting, and they traveled, visiting Samuel in Denver and Emma in Colorado Springs, where she was teaching and engaged to be married. Emma's wedding in the summer of 1898 was a joyous affair. Held in the church Ethan had helped build years ago, she married a fellow teacher named Michael Grant, a good man who clearly adored her, and Ethan walked her down the aisle with tears streaming down his face. Sarah cried too, and Jacob, now 18 and studying in Fort Collins, stood as one of the groomsmen looking impossibly grown up in his suit. Where did the time go? Ethan whispered to Sarah during the reception, watching Emma dance with her new husband. It went into them, Sarah replied, gesturing to their 3 adult children laughing and talking with friends, into building them into good people. And now they are building their own lives, just like we did. Samuel married in 1900, a smart woman named Catherine, who worked as a secretary at his engineering firm, and they settled in Denver. Jacob finished veterinary school in 1901 and opened a practice in Colorado City, moving into a small house just down the street from Ethan and Sarah. He remained unmarried, too focused on his work and the menagerie of animals he was constantly rescuing, and Ethan saw echoes of his own younger self in Jacob's dedication to purpose over personal comfort. The new century brought changes to Colorado City. The town had grown into a proper city, with electric lights and telephones and automobiles that terrified Ethan with their noise and speed. He was 60 now, his hair and beard gone almost completely gray, his body marked by years of hard physical labor and old war wounds that ached in cold weather. But he was alive and healthy and surrounded by love, which was more than he had ever dreamed possible. Samuel and Catherine had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Emma and Michael had 3, and Jacob's house was always full of animals but empty of children. Ethan and Sarah became devoted grandparents, spoiling their grandchildren with hand-carved toys and baked goods, teaching them to fish in the creek and identify plants in the mountains. Ethan told them carefully edited stories about the war, teaching them about bravery and sacrifice without burdening them with the horrors, and they listened with wide eyes, making him promise to tell them again and again. On October 15, 1903, Ethan turned 63 years old, and his entire family gathered at the house to celebrate. Samuel came from Denver with his family, Emma from Colorado Springs, and Jacob walked over from his practice with his current favorite dog, a scruffy mutt he had named General. The house was full of noise and laughter and love, and Ethan stood in the center of it, all feeling overwhelmed by gratitude. Sarah found him later, standing alone on the porch looking out at the mountains that had once been his refuge and prison. She slipped her hand into his, her fingers thin and marked with age spots now, but still steady and strong. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, the same question she had been asking for 35 years. "I am thinking about that day in 1868 when you screamed, and I should have kept walking, but I did not," Ethan said. "I am thinking about how that one decision changed everything, gave me this whole rich, beautiful life I am living. I am thinking about how lucky I am." "We are both lucky," Sarah corrected, resting her head on his shoulder the way she had done thousands of times before. "We found each other when we both needed saving, and we built something wonderful together. 3 amazing children, 5 grandchildren so far, a life full of love and purpose. Not bad for a broken soldier and a scared young woman." "Not bad at all," Ethan agreed, pulling her close and kissing her silver hair. "You know, I still have nightmares sometimes. Not as often, and they are not as bad, but they are still there." "I know," Sarah said gently. "But you also have good dreams now, and you have this life, and you have me. The nightmares do not get to win, Ethan. They never got to win because you kept fighting, kept choosing to live and love and build, instead of giving in to the darkness." They stood together as the sun set over the mountains, surrounded by the sounds of their family inside, and Ethan felt a peace so profound it brought tears to his eyes. The war had tried to destroy him, had carved pieces out of his soul and left him bleeding in the dirt, but he had survived. More than survived, he had thrived, had built a life worth living, had loved and been loved in return. Samuel called from inside that they were cutting the cake, and Ethan and Sarah went back in together, hand in hand, ready to celebrate another year of life earned through struggle and sacrifice and love. As Ethan looked around at his children and grandchildren, at Sarah's glowing face in the lamplight, at the home they had built together, board by board, and year by year, he knew with absolute certainty that every nightmare had been worth it to get to this moment. The years after 60 passed more quickly than those before, as if time itself was speeding up to match the rhythm of Ethan's aging body. He officially retired from carpentry in 1905, handing over his tools to Jacob, who had started doing woodworking as a hobby. Sarah retired from her occasional tutoring around the same time, and they spent their days in quiet companionship, tending the garden, reading and enjoying visits from their ever-growing family. Emma had another baby in 1906. Samuel's daughter got married in 1907, and Jacob finally courted a woman, the new veterinarian who had moved to town to work with him. They married in a small ceremony in 1908, and Ethan walked Jacob down the aisle with his cane tapping against the church floor, his heart full of joy for his youngest child. The nightmares had faded to almost nothing by then, appearing only a few times a year, and even when they came, Ethan could manage them without waking Sarah. He had made peace with his past, had processed the trauma through decades of love and support and hard work, and while the scars would never fully disappear, they no longer controlled his life. On their 50th wedding anniversary in November 1918, their children threw them a grand celebration at the church. The entire town seemed to turn out, filling the building with friends and family and well-wishers who had watched Ethan and Sarah build their life together over 5 decades. There were speeches and toasts, and Ethan stood at the front of the church with Sarah beside him, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love. 50 years ago I married this woman, convinced I did not deserve her, Ethan said when it was his turn to speak, his voice wavering with age and emotion. I was a broken man fresh from war, carrying nightmares and scars and damage I thought would destroy me. But Sarah saw past all that. She saw the person I could become if someone believed in me enough, and she spent the next 50 years proving that belief was justified. She gave me 3 incredible children. She gave me a home and purpose and love beyond measure. She saved my life in every way a person can be saved, and I am grateful for every single day I have gotten to spend as her husband. Sarah was crying openly, and so was half the church, and when Ethan pulled her into his arms for a kiss, the crowd erupted in applause. They danced to a slow waltz played on the church piano, Ethan's movements stiff from arthritis but his hold on Sarah as strong as ever, and as they swayed together he whispered in her ear, "I love you more today than I did 50 years ago, and I will love you even more tomorrow, and I love you," Sarah whispered back, "always and forever, my mountain man, my hero, my heart." They lived 7 more years together, 7 years of quiet joy and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, of sitting on the porch watching sunsets and talking about their incredible journey from broken strangers to lifelong partners. Ethan's health declined slowly but steadily, his old war wounds catching up with him, and Sarah nursed him through it with the same patient devotion she had shown that first night in the mountains, on a warm September evening in 1925. With Sarah holding his hand and his children gathered around his bed, Ethan Young took his last breath. He was 85 years old, had lived 60 years past the end of the war that tried to destroy him, and he died surrounded by the family he had never thought he would have. His last words were to Sarah, a whispered, "Thank you for saving me," and she held him as he slipped away peacefully, finally free from all nightmares. Sarah lived another 3 years, spending them with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling stories about Ethan and keeping his memory alive. She spoke of the day he had saved her in the valley, of how he had been so broken but had chosen to help her anyway, of how their love had healed them both. She showed the grandchildren the journal Ethan had kept for over 50 years, pages and pages of his thoughts and dreams and gradual healing, and she made sure they understood that love could triumph over even the worst trauma if you were brave enough to accept it. When Sarah died peacefully in her sleep in January 1928, she was buried beside Ethan in the cemetery overlooking the mountains, their matching headstones marking the resting place of 2 souls who had found each other in the darkness and built a life in the light. Their children placed flowers on the graves, and Samuel told his own grandchildren the story of how their great-grandparents had met, how a broken soldier and a frightened woman had saved each other and built a legacy of love that would echo through generations. The house Ethan had built still stood on the edge of Colorado City, eventually passed down to Jacob and his wife, then to their children, and onward through the years. The porch where Ethan and Sarah had spent countless evenings remained, and sometimes on quiet September nights when the air smelled of autumn and the mountains glowed in the setting sun, those who sat there swore they could feel the presence of the 2 people who had loved so deeply, who had proven that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and patience and love. In the end, Ethan Young had come home from war with nothing but nightmares. A broken mountain man convinced his life was over at 27, but Sarah Jensen had found him in those mountains and shown him that life could begin again, that love was stronger than trauma, that peace was possible even for those who had seen the worst humanity had to offer. Together they had built something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of human resilience and the healing force of unconditional love. Their story became legend in Colorado City, passed down through generations as an example of hope and redemption. People spoke of the war veteran who had nearly lost himself to darkness and the brave woman who had pulled him back into the light. They spoke of 57 years of marriage built on mutual support and unwavering devotion, of 3 children raised with love and wisdom, of a life lived fully despite starting from the broken pieces of trauma and loss. And in the mountains above Colorado City, where Ethan had once hidden from the world, where Sarah had first heard his story and chosen to stay, the wind whispered through the pines carrying their story forward into the future, a reminder that no one is ever too broken to heal, too lost to be found, or too damaged to deserve love. All it takes is one person willing to see past the scars to the person underneath, one moment of bravery to change the course of 2 lives forever. Ethan and Sarah Young had proven that truth, had lived it every day for nearly 6 decades, and their legacy lived on in the hearts of everyone who heard their story and dared to believe that love could conquer even the darkest nights, that peace was possible even after the longest wars, and that sometimes the best way to save yourself is to save someone else first.